All right. Hello. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's event. My name is Mohammed Gamrawi. I am the Senior Program Coordinator at the Jaffer Center for Muslim World Studies here at the Green School at Florida International University. On behalf of the Green School at FIU, I want to welcome everyone to today's event, which is a part of the Green School at Books and Books series. We're very grateful for the collaboration with Books and Books, as well as the co-sponsorship of the Ruth and Shepard Distinguished Lecture Series, the Jaffer Center for Muslim World Studies, and the Center for Women's and Gender Studies. With that, I have the pleasure of serving as today's moderator for your event, and we'd like to thank you all for joining us. I'd like to welcome you to this virtual event, which will be discussing a very timely interdisciplinary book in international relations, Middle Eastern politics, and women's and gender studies. Syria has been in a civil war for nearly a decade now. And one of the consequences of this civil war has been the Syrian refugee crisis, one of the largest refugee and displacement crises of our time. Over 5 million Syrians currently identify as refugees, many of whom are in neighboring countries such as Jordan and Lebanon. I'm joined today with Dr. Jessia Abu Arab, the author of Reframing Syrian Refugee Insecurity Through a Feminist Lens, The Case of Lebanon. In her groundbreaking work, Jessia Abu Arab looks at Syrian refugees in Lebanon, particularly through a feminist lens. To further discuss her work, its implications, and other geopolitical dynamics within the region, I'm also joined by a great panel of experts from on the region. We have with us today Dr. Eric Loeb, Associate Professor in the Department of Politics and International Relations, Dr. Suzanne Zwingel, Associate Professor in the Department of Politics and International Relations, and finally, Dr. Claire Porter, who is the Director of the Gender and Sexuality Studies Program at the University of Miami. Throughout this event, I'd like to go ahead and invite you in the audience to please ask your questions through the chat box. We will have a Q&A session later on in the segment. So please send us your questions as they come to your mind, and we'll go ahead and answer as many of them as we can. I'll also be including a link in the chat box, which will take you to the page where you can purchase a copy of this new book and support the author. And now, without further ado, I'd like to go ahead and begin today's event by introducing the author, Jessia Abu Arab. Jessie, can you please talk to us a little bit about your inspiration for this book? Where did you get the idea? What conducting the research in Lebanon was like? What your findings were? And why this work is important for the field and for future scholarship?
Definitely. So good morning, everyone, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to present my research, my book, my recently published book, Reframing Syrian Refugee Insecurity Through a Feminist Lens. I would like to thank the three panelists who kindly agreed to be part of this today's event. As you know, this project has been a product of years of research where a lot of amazing people helped me along the way. From the title that went through a zillion iterations, thank you, Michaela, Celeste, to the actual product with amazing people who oversaw my work, helped me revise the sections and whatnot. So thank you, Susan, Eric, Harry, Dennis, and many more. So I really appreciate you so much. So the original purpose of this book started with, the big word, refugee crisis around the globe, where this word became politicized, groups of people became, basically stereotyped, standardized as aliens crossing international recognized borders in search of security. Many states showed empathy. The humanitarian community pushed for them to help those people in need that had no voice, no agency, dependent on them, on these groups to protect them, provide them basic assistance and whatnot. And from another end, you hear a lot of rhetoric, policies, national security rhetoric saying that we need to securitize our borders, build walls, send them back, and all these stuff for them to secure national security and objectifying those people as a threat that is threatening their way of life. So those people that were seeking asylum, I felt that they were not seen as a diverse groups of people forcibly displaced into various spaces. right? And also this vision of these people moving from poor developing countries all the way to those rich developed countries is also inaccurate. More than 90% of refugee movement, forcibly displaced people, move between neighboring countries that have common history, long history of friendship and animosity at the same time. So this perceived dichotomous view, this dualist view, the duality in it as a refugee that needs help, voiceless, without agency, and at the same time looking at them as this threat where it's gonna threaten security, economy, your culture, aliens that are coming to invade your space is also inaccurate. So I felt that looking at Lebanon, a case with Syrian refugees would be ideal for me to break down this stereotype and look at it closely. So first of all, my background being a Middle Eastern, Lebanese, American woman, I am both an insider and outsider to this. See, growing up in Lebanon, I witnessed many crises there, civil wars and whatnot, where I was and my family was, like many Lebanese family, were forced to move around to be protected from missiles and bomb shellings and whatnot. So this topic is no stranger to me. But at the same time, I feel due to my privilege moving to the US and whatnot, I'm an outsider to what's happening now in Lebanon. As you all know, the collapse, economic collapse, political collapse, all these stuff happening, I'm in a way foreign to it. So I decided that I wanted to look at it closely, you know, tracing the different steps that this refugee management happened within the case of Lebanon, and looking at a case where uh, a third of the Lebanese population now was at a certain point actually formed from Syrian refugees. So when Lebanon shamed the entire world of taking that big group of refugees into its country, a lot of burden and anxieties and reignited a xenophobic collective memory within Lebanese constituents who used to look at Syrians as a source of domination, where not a long time ago, Syria used to have boots on the ground controlling and occupying a majority of Lebanese territory, and where Lebanon was and still facing a fragile sectarian balance between Christians and Muslims, and where that 1.5 million at a certain point of time of incoming Syrians to the country was a threat to their social fabric. Again, a third of its population, so that's a big number. So I went and did the field work, Muhammad, on the ground across the years. I did expert interviews with those people in charge, from government agencies to UNHCR employees and whatnot. And I discovered that the majority of the Syrian refugees that were seeking refugeeism in Lebanon were women. Actually, 79% of them were women and children. And when asked about their husband, either they were back still in Syria fighting the war, disappeared, imprisoned, or did not seek for them to be registered out of fear or having different various ways, mechanism to adapt to their new reality. So I decided to look at it from a feminist lens, right? Where the purpose here is to explore the breadth and the depth of this forced migration, that where women seem to be silenced the most, right? They were not receiving the necessary attention in news media, nor policy approaches, not even in humanitarian aid, which they do highlight them, but again, taking out of their voice. So looking at these two major agencies and whatnot, I realized that, you know what, women have something valuable to contribute here. As an oppressed group, they were unable to achieve any sort of security within their stay in Lebanon. And also the goal here is not just to critique the mechanism, but in a way to look forward to, in a way, a social transformation, to look at this situation in a different lens. So through the lived experience and different mechanism, expert interviews, and a technique I called photo voice, where I included actually Lebanese volunteers, where also Lebanese host communities were silenced due to this portrayal. I felt that I would enrich this research by exhibiting both them as local Lebanese having anxieties, hopes, and fears of this foreign group that was once the image of domination and control, right? Suddenly now there are people in need that they need to be helped. And at the same time, them reaching out, bridging that bridge and reaching out to those people in a way to get to know them and see how can they collaborate and surpass um, this barrier between them in a way to help both of them grow together. So unfortunately, within my research, I discovered a vicious cycle, what I called within my book a vicious cycle. There's a lot of images that the participant collected and we all reflected on, and we came up with a lot of interesting ideas. Adding to that, the news information and the expert interviews, which basically concurred with our findings. See, at the beginning, as I said, they homogenized them through a security threat, the Lebanese government, that they are burdened and they need international help. And these Syrian people should not be considered as refugees. Lebanon, as a sovereign country, have the right to welcome these people or not. And at the same time, that same government needed to work with the UNHCR government that basically looks at them under the refugee law, that they are, the refugee convention, that they are actually refugees escaping terror and fearing for their life in seeking security. Now, this work between both the government and the UNHCR, this push and pull, created this kind of project, this kind of, in a way, practice of help on the one hand, helping these refugees, but not fully enough for them to be seen as refugees, right? And at the same time, creating exclusionary practices where they want to separate them, they wanted to deport some of them, creating ad hoc detention, no camp policy, giving the past history with Palestinian refugees. The Lebanese government was fearing of creating formal camps. This is why we see erection of informal camps on private properties and whatnot. And at the same time, creating informal camps in a way created another insecurity within the communities where overpopulation happened, increase of rents and space, physical terrorist threats that were happening, job competition with Syrians, and of course the economy worsening by the day. So when they looked at refugees and security, a lot of practices happened where you find they were not able to be assimilated, find jobs and whatnot. Only 3 types of job were provided in sanitation, construction, and agricultural business. And given that the majority of refugees, we said, are women, these 3 types of jobs are in a way seen as not viable for them to be out there and at risk of being genderly abused. So many women ended up having a lack of legal social protection due to them being in the middle, not seen as formal refugees, having just papers saying that they are under the mandate of the UNHCR, not being able to work, nor purchase, nor anything on their own, dependent on those aids. And also many negative coping skills came on, which brought us to the objectification processes, like what they ended up having to do to adapt to their new reality, which I called in my book a blowback, the negative coping strategies. Many women, many families, Syrian families opted to marrying their younger daughter. Early child marriage has increased, and given their situation as Syrian women refugees, in a way they faced a double tragedy, where them being a woman, due to their gender in Lebanon, it did not help them to adapt easily. See, as a woman in Lebanon, you are seen as a second-class citizen in a way, this which I call, where Lebanese women cannot even provide their children citizenship, Lebanese citizenship, if their father is not Lebanese. You have most of Lebanese women follow religious personal laws, which are in a way discriminatory to them. Um, Gender-based violence, domestic violence, honor crime, all these stuff, they're not really well taken care of from the government. And that's for Lebanese women, right? How about a displaced person who do not even have a refugee status within the country, and it's basically a double whammy. So you find a lot of cases of sex trafficking, human trafficking, early forced marriages on the rise, minimal privacy, many of them being, you know, assaulted by local residents, and they cannot even report to the local governments due to their precarious legal status and all this stuff, which I advise you to read and get into the details. But all in all, my goal from this book was to, in a way, enrich this talk and break down these stereotypes that often objectify people as objects of security or objects of help, where the focus of humanitarian aid is basically to get fund, to raise and provide shelters and whatnot, without really taking into consideration the contextualities and who are the people on the ground they are trying to help. So a lot of new dynamics went out, where you have a shawish phenomena that I call, where a man that is basically the middleman between these families that are the household headed by women and the government and UNHCR. And here you find a lot of aids that come in, kind of went through around and in a way mismanaged, that these women and children end up being in a worse situation. Through our field trip, we find a lot of children ended up not being able to go to schools because of the curfews and the mismanagement of the Lebanese municipalities and whatnot. Many women ended up working illegally, illicitly in the field or in people's houses, putting them at risk, as well as the women or the wives of the enemy. Remember this kind of Lebanese anxieties of having Syrians who not long time ago were seen as this occupation force in Lebanon, that Lebanese had to march in millions to get them out. So all in all, I really enjoyed writing this book. In a way, for me, it created this kind of radical shift on how one needs to open up and look at the details of the situation in order to see new opportunities, and not just that go beyond the securitized host government that needs to build walls and these alien groups, or the counterproductive humanitarian agenda of service providers whose aim is to make them look silenced, voiceless, dependent in order to get more aid. And actually, by creating this dialogue, we destabilize this kind of, I call the gendered power relations in an appropriate way to create kind of this normative change. So instead of seeing women's insecurity as secondary to whole state interest and refugee governance in general, once we prioritize them and see them that they have agency, they have resiliency, we help them come up with positive coping skills that would kind of improve the current situation in Lebanon by building and creating partnership and basically bridging that barrier. And those local anxieties that were built up from two communities living together but not really knowing each other. So in a way, this would be a base for my future work, where I'm gonna dig even deeper into the situation and look at the various minority groups. Again, not all women Syrian refugees are the same, different class, religion, social status, and whatnot, help some of them over others. And of course, you have other minority groups going into there that I would like to look into further. So with that, therefore, I would pass the talk to you, Muhammad. Thank you for letting me have this talk.
Of course. No, thank you, Jesse. And thank you for those wonderful explanations of your work. I mean, it's obvious your work is very important, and we have a lot of complexities and dynamics that we could discuss during the rest of this talk and hopefully in the Q&A. But for now, I'd like to go ahead and move next to Dr. Eric Loeb. Eric, given your expertise on Lebanese and Syrian politics, can you maybe give us some input or background on how the influx of over 1 million Syrian refugees has impacted the region?
Sure, thank you. First, I'd like to congratulate Jesse on this book. It just seems like just yesterday that you were defending your dissertation, and I think it was maybe a year or two ago, and to have already turned this around into a book, I think really requires some congratulations. Obviously, a book that is based on impressive field work in Lebanon, and that covers, as Mohammed said, a very rich, complex topic, very competently, very well. So congratulations again. So in terms of, I think Jessie and her book describe the problem well, and I can contribute some of my expertise and experiences on the ground in countries like Syria and Lebanon. And alongside Yemen, I mean, we really start with the Arab Spring in 2010, 2011, when there was a mass protests and demonstrations that started in Tunisia and swept across the region. And not only did it not lead to the type of political and social change that a lot of people were hoping for in the region, but in countries like Yemen and Syria and Libya and elsewhere, it led to civil wars that have not been resolved today. And particularly when you look at Yemen and when you look at Syria, we're talking about really probably the largest humanitarian disasters in the world. I mean, people are literally, as the civil war continues in Yemen, people are literally starving. They're not getting the medicine that they need or medical treatment now in the midst of a pandemic. And over in Syria, if you just think about the numbers, you had a population of about 22 million people at one point. And now when we look at the numbers of refugees, we're talking about at least 5 million who have had to leave Syria. That's 23% of the population. When we look at internally displaced persons, just people who have had to move within Syria, you're looking at about 6 million. And that's 27% of the population. And so, as Jesse correctly said, a lot of these people went to neighboring countries. That was the nearest place they could go across the border. So predominantly in Turkey, Lebanon, and in Jordan, we're looking at 4% now of the Turkish population. And this is just registered refugees that are Syrian refugees. In Lebanon, at least 14%. In Jordan, 10%. I mean, just astronomical figures. If you were to wake up in any one of these countries, you would see a very visible, large, robust refugee presence there. And, as Jesse said, initially, and, I was on the ground to see this as well, there was this sentiment of sympathy that on the part of the government or the host governments, the host populations, that then transitioned to securitization, where the objective was really to contain these refugees into specific areas, and not to have them visibly in public to the fullest extent possible. And hearing people on the ground all of a sudden, equating these individuals to security threats, right? That to equating them with, groups like ISIS and Al Qaeda and stigmatizing these people. When Jesse says, most of these people, we're talking about families, and a large percentage, and this speaks in conflict in general when you study conflict in some of the courses I teach, that a majority of the victims are women and children. And as she says, about 70% of people. And, as she correctly said, of course, you have to think about the state's perspective, because these large refugee populations put enormous pressure on the economy, on society, on the demographics, particularly an area like Lebanon, which is so fragile in terms of the demographics and the different groups and confessions there. And people remembering the influx of Palestinian refugees, some people rightly or wrongly blaming that as a cause of the civil war that happened there for 15 years between 1975 and 1990. So of course, there's anxiety and concern on the part of the state and the population that should not be overlooked. But on the other hand, I think agency is the correct word, that these people are trapped between a government and a population that now securitizes them. And even on the Syrian side, something that I've looked at, people that are, really the tide of the conflict in Syria turned in 2016, where pro-government forces in Syria began to consolidate more and more territory. And so as that process unfolded, more refugees from Lebanon and elsewhere could think about returning, but have not been able to, because they are really caught between a Lebanese government where their status is ambiguous, where they're securitized, and also in Syria where they're securitized, where the al-Assad regime, the Syrian government, wants to make sure that the people coming back are the right people. So people are being screened upon coming back. Some people can't go back because between 2015 to 2018, the Syrian government passed legislation that authorized the authorities to expropriate, let's say, housing and property from IDPs and refugees into government control, and then redistribute it to other people. So, on the flip side is, where can these people go at this point? It's very much a similar situation as the Palestinians. So, these are very much people that are without a home, that are really caught in no man's land. Again, it's important, of course, to think about where the states and the host populations are coming from, but also to think about even, the men who are part of these refugee populations. How are they going to provide for their families? How are they going to take care of themselves, take care of their dependents and their loved ones? There's just, this loss of agency. And, as well-intentioned, as Jesse says, as the international humanitarian organizations may be, they're not necessarily providing the goods and services that, that are really overlapping with the priorities of these people, or even putting them in a position of empowerment. I did see one story where instead of just distributing food to refugees, they were giving them meal tickets where they can go and shop in stores and commissaries, giving them a sense of empowerment. And I think more of those types of programs are needed. And of course, now the stakes are higher with the pandemic. I think this makes them being viewed as even more of a security threat. If the pandemic breaks out in these camps, the stakes are even higher now for these states and their populations. And of course, a country like Lebanon, which is already suffering economically and socially, culminated by the explosion at the Beirut port recently, this doesn't put these individuals in a more advantageous position, not to mention just this global wave of anti-immigration and building walls and blaming immigrants on economic and social problems also puts these populations at a disadvantageous position. So I'll just end my remarks there, and I look forward to the Q&A and further discussion. Thanks.
Great, thank you so much, Dr. Loeb. Now we'll go ahead and move on to Dr. Suzanne Swingle. Suzanne, looking specifically to the laws and norms on refugees, and given your expertise on international norm translation, gender equality advocacy, women's rights, what is your take on the challenges of translating global refugee norms in the specific case of Syrian refugees in Lebanon?
Thank you very much, Mo. I would like to echo first and foremost Dr. Loeb's praise and congratulations for Jesse. By the way, this is, I don't know if you can, oh no, you can't see it. this is how the book looks like. I'm very proud of this personally. So lovely to have a public debate about your work, Jessie, in this format. So I'm really happy to be here. Okay, so I have thought a lot about this general question, how laws or norms that have global support get into lived realities of people for whom those norms were actually made, right? So I have written, for example, about gender equality frameworks, which are very strongly supported now by multilateral organizations all over the place. The UN started with that, but then many others also followed. So this seems to be like a very global consensus, you know, with backs and forths. But then if you look at how people live, it hasn't really connected to realities on the ground. I think that's fair to say. There's no country in the world where we have something resembling gender equality yet, right? So Jess's book looks at a different, looks at an intersecting set of global norms there. She looks at gender equality norms as well, but first and foremost, she looks at the global refugee regime that we have. It also has been developing in the context of the United Nations for several decades, and looks at how this framework has been applied to the case of Lebanon. I think from my perspective, one could say this is what the book does. Of course, it does many other things. It is super, it has all these rich descriptions, and it's a really wonderful book. And I think in short, I mean, so as we have already heard, I mean, Lebanon is a situation, it's a very sort of a fragile, very specific kind of state that's very connected to international phenomena. I mean, on the one hand, refugee mobilizations, but also presence of international organizations and so forth. So it's clearly a state where those international frameworks play a role in a way, right? And I think in short, one could say that what you show in the book is how difficult it is to connect a global framework to a complex reality, or one could maybe even say this case shows a failure and a need for redirection or rethinking of those frameworks and rethinking how those lofty ideas could be made much more realizable in practice for people who are suffering, right? So if I come from sort of this international perspective of the international refugee regime, I would say this regime in itself has already some problems, but I mean, so the question, the idea of this framework is to help refugees, people in a particular situation that are very much in need of support and help, right? But again, so if you just look at what the international community has come up with, there's a lot of things that make this a problematic regime, I would say. I'm just highlighting maybe 4 issues here. One is that while the Refugee Convention, for example, spells out rights for refugees, it doesn't really spell out responsibilities for states. And of course, Lebanon hasn't even ratified it. That's one thing, right? Then secondly, it thinks of refugees in a very particular way. I think it thinks more about people fleeing from governmental repression, right? It doesn't necessarily think of very big groups fleeing from warfare or you know, socioeconomic tensions and problems and so forth. It's also not a regime that has a gender focus. It's very lately sort of latched onto it in a way. So it's, you know, while you can think of, for example, gender-based persecution as, you know, being in the context, people had to make a lot of efforts to get it in there. Advocates had to do that, right? And also, I think, so it's not the most useful, I guess, framework to think of gendered insecurities as you do, and as, you know, the reality on the ground shows itself. And also, I think it really doesn't think of refugees as people with agency. These are objects, right? Those are recipients of help. They are passive in that construction. So there is a lot of problems in the framework, but of course, you know, it's a framework that wants to support. Now, this framework hits the ground in Lebanon, right? So you have this, it's very, very interestingly described in the book. You have this collaboration between the Lebanese state and UNHCR, the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, right? And they devised this response plan, and it really wants to help. And I guess, again, very importantly, in a situation of such hardship, that there are some support structures. So the intention, again, seems to be very useful. But then what happens is that this framework, and this is partly state actions, partly UNHCR action, this framework does, I think, helps to some extent, but what you mostly see is that you have either the ignorance of the insecurities that are created, or the state actually actively creates insecurities, and especially in the legal context. You know, this idea of statelessness of children born in Lebanon by Syrian mothers without the fathers in any way present, the denial of work permits. So in a way, you have all these elements that make the people who are already so vulnerable even more vulnerable, right? And then I think the other thing that's really interesting, so we have this idea of a passive refugee, but this is a very gendered process, right? So for the women, this seems to be exacerbated. Women are sort of seen in their traditional roles and even more constructed as passive, whereas the male refugees are actually constructed as a threat, as terrorists or whatever it is. And of course, the women in their passivity are also a threat because they have such a burden to society, but it's a very gendered construction of refugees in a way. So that's a very beautifully carved out in the book, and it's also somewhat painful to read, right? What I think is a real wonderful strength of the book is then to basically turn around from, you know, from looking at this somewhat failed, misapplied support framework that has this global underpinning, to look at the people for which it's meant and what they do, right? And you see these unbelievable difficulties people are in, but nevertheless in those difficulties and in their suffering, right? They are agents. They are agents, and your framework brings this out very, very visibly, right? They are agents. They are resilient. They are resourceful, right? They are, of course, under the constraints they are under. They are not necessarily always making the best choices, if you want. I mean, you have some. How do you call this? Resiliency strategies. For example, this practice, which really is visible there, that girls are married very young, right? As children, actually, because that seems to be the only way, from the perspective of the parents, to provide some security for the girls, right? So, you know, there's things that, you know, you have to make choices in that situation where, I guess one could say, if a global framework were more understanding of the problems and constraints of the individuals, maybe there could be some remedies, some alternatives that could be developed, right? If you think about providing security for people who want to help themselves, that kind of vision, right? Which we don't really see in the global framework. We see a real disconnect, also misappropriation of resources and corruption and so forth. But so in a way, there's a lot of outlooks in the book where you feel like, okay, this needs to be further developed, right? And for me, I mean, thinking back to the global framework, I think that's really a takeaway from this book. I mean, I think we have seen this not only for Lebanon, also in many other contexts, that the global refugee framework is in need of reform. It actually, you know, they are trying to reform it right now. There's this global compact, this new deal for refugees in a way. And of course, this is limited by states willing to buy into this and actually provide resources. And we really have to think about our own states that are very far away from these refugee situations as having responsibility there. I think that's very, very important. And I think really the two elements that would be necessary for a rethinking of this framework is, number one, exactly what Jesse brings out, which is the agency of refugees, thinking of refugees as active makers of their short, but more importantly, also long-term future and outlook, right? And then also what I always thought, I think, you know, we have in the global context this instrument of resettlement, which I think is actually a really good idea, but it's unbelievably underused, you know, also because states resist it in a way. And just to give you a number here, I mean, I looked these numbers up yesterday at UNHCR. They have listed 79.5 million of people currently forcibly displaced. Okay, and now listen to this: 107 6,800 people have been resettled in the same time. This is 1/10 of 1% of all people who are displaced. Okay, so there would be so much more, potential as an international community to support people helping themselves than we have right now. So I think your book is one of a very specific and beautifully crafted case to say, well, this has to be done differently, and on all levels of decision making and collaboration, there are problems, and I think I have a few ideas to fix those. So I hope you tell them. Okay. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Zwingel. Now we'll go ahead and move on to our next panelist, Dr. Claire Porter. Claire, given your expertise on the topic of gender and forced migration, when looking at the case of Syrian refugees in Lebanon, how do you see it relating to other trends of gender and forced migration in the Middle East and North Africa region?
Well, first of all, before I launch into all of that, I'd like to say thanks for FIU and for Stephen J. Green's School of International Public Affairs for hosting this, and Books and Books as well. And thanks so much to Jesse for writing this book, and for the invitation to be part of this panel as well. There are so many commonalities between Jesse's research and other refugees' situations across the Middle East and North Africa region. And I'd like to discuss just a few examples around these issues of politics of representation, gender power relationships among refugees in the camps, and also between refugees and those organizations, and the sort of mitigators in the organizations, and in the new dynamics around refugee labor dynamics as well. So I wanted to start just because I was so struck in Jesse's book by the descriptions of these gendered politics of representation of refugees. And Jesse describes photos of women and children refugees, usually smiling, that are strategically used by aid agencies and organizations to gain support. And these images of women are usually, they're usually smiling alongside children. But I would note that the women themselves are never pregnant, right? Because that becomes a sort of, like a threat in a lot of people's minds in terms of taxing resources, et cetera. But they're smiling alongside children, and they're really employing these ideas of femininity and motherhood that are seen as sort of hopeful, but also in some ways conflating women with children. So there's this, tendency to put like women and children together like one word, and also to see them as non-threatening. And that's always juxtaposed against representations of refugee men, and I'll get into that. So similarly, in Jordan's vast Syrian refugee camps, photos of women and children are also prominent in humanitarian literature. And while these images of men are almost non-existent or existent and very little in the research, and Sarah Tobin has noted this in her research in the Zaatari camps. And I'm going to put a pin in that issue of refugee men and their sort of absence from those photos and other issues of masculinity for now, and get back to that a little bit later in this discussion. So I'd like to first move to the sort of the other side of the MENA region, and just point out research done on Sahrawi refugee women in Western Sahara, and that's Elena Fidian-Kazmieh's research that's published in her book, The Ideal Refugee. And she finds that Sahrawi refugee women carefully cultivate an image for humanitarian agencies and aid agencies, especially Western ones, that jibes with liberal feminist ethos. And the Sahrawis not only continue to get much needed humanitarian aid, although not enough. They're constantly not quite, you know, getting enough aid that they need. But they do this through the cultivation of this image of a modern Muslim feminist Arab woman that's well nigh utopian. And they find themselves in these refugee camps so popular that women, particularly Western feminists from aid organizations, but also just Western feminists who are tourists, coming and touring and staying with these refugee women in the camps to, you know, to see and experience firsthand this, this idea of this sort of utopian, egalitarian, you know, feminist society among the Sahrawi refugees. Of course, what Fidian Kazmieh sees as she does her participant observation research over a very long time is that there, you know, the cultivation of this image is obviously highly agentive, right? These women are they're enacting a kind of agency in doing this, but it's exacting a price on them because they have to also strategically cover and cover up gender-based violence between themselves and men in the camps. And they have to construe their labor exploitation as empowerment. So there are lots of photo images of Sahrawi women in the camps pitching their own tents together with other women. And there are these, you know, these beautifully colorful kind of images, gowns and, you know, scarves, and they're pitching them in the desert together and smiling. And it's, you know, these images are very popular. They play well. But what doesn't get asked are these questions about, well, you know, what does it mean for low-income women to be expected to do so much labor that's unwaged, right? And tends to be undervalued and devalued because it's become feminized or because it's feminized. So I wanted to start there with some of that, some of the problematics of the politics of representation here as well. And then move on to other issues of gender power relations in refugee camps as well. Okay, sorry, hold on one moment. So has already been noted, I think that you know, Jesse you know, describes you know, the incidence, the high incidence of gender-based violence among Syrian refugees in Lebanon. In a 2015 study in Jordan's refugee camps, it was uncovered that 40% of women and girls had experienced sexual abuse. And we know that these kinds of crimes are underreported, so the number is probably higher, right? Early marriage or, you know, underage child marriage has also already been mentioned. Important to note, as Sarah Tobin was doing her research in the Zaatari camps, she found that one of the impetus for you know, getting girls married really young was that a newly married couple gets their own tent and some other resources, right? Without unintentionally, the aid organizations can be kind of complicit with early child marriage. But at the same time, there can be a kind of a use or a misuse of cultural narratives. And from an anthropological standpoint, this is very problematic, of this idea that, well, this is, you know, child marriage is something that people in this culture are comfortable with. And so them doing it in the context of this, you know, of this refugee camp is acceptable because it's part of their culture. So girls and women also have a much more difficult time accessing the education that is offered within the camps themselves. Many girls seem to be in an almost kind of, in Jordan, seem to be in an almost kind of like a trafficking kind of situation with local officials in temporary marriages to get food, assistance, other kinds of resources for themselves and their families as well. Danielle Spencer's research on the aid sector in Jordan found that Jordan and Syria, I believe, found that there was a kind of ignoring of gender-based violence that I think Jessie brings to light very, very well. That there's a kind of sacrifice of girls' and women's issues to get aid. And to that point, Spencer states that, quote, sexual exploitation and abuse of women and girls has been ignored. Somewhere there's been a decision made that it's okay for women's bodies to continue to be used, abused, and violated in order for aid to be delivered to a larger group of people, end quote. And all of this needs to be thought of really carefully when we're talking about women's issues, right? You know, the obvious, you know, and really devastating violence that's done against women that Jessie describes, and Jessie, your description of, you know, women being trafficked is just, I mean, it's just so vivid, you know, and painful to read. Another issue of gender we need to attend to that I think feminists have done a particularly good job of and continue to rework is questions of masculinity, right? What kinds of questions can we ask about masculinities, plural, really? And here Paul Amar, you know, describes this Middle East masculinity industry producing data on what he describes as atavistic, racialized, class obfuscated depictions of Arab men. And of utmost importance in Amar's analysis is his critique of this class obfuscation. And the critique of the patriarchy concept itself is still necessary. While I would agree, Jessie, that the concept of patriarchy is still very important, right? And still carries a lot of analytical weight. But in UN documents on refugee men, they're often presented simply as a threat. And sometimes it's through what's not said about them directly and what's said about women that there's this monolithic portrait of Arab and particularly Muslim men that's portrayed here. And some of this is based on these sort of assumptions that come out of Connell's very important theory of hegemonic masculinity, that men who've been rendered refugees have been in some ways emasculated and therefore have become marginalized, and marginal masculinities are more likely to abuse women or sexually and otherwise as a way to build back up what they've lost through the humiliation of having to flee through violence they've endured themselves from other men, etc. Now, one of the problems here is, as Jack McGinn has noted, lies in the UN's intervention strategies that assume a kind of backwards cultural construction of masculinity among Arab men. And this elides Arab masculinity's constructions with familial connectivity, reciprocity, self-sacrifice, and a sense of responsibility to community that's also evident in many refugee situations in the MENA region. And so the last thing we want to do is be led to these sort of dismal conclusions about refugee men and masculinity. Anthropologists find a lot of nuance in research on MENA refugee men, like Michael Vicente Perez's research on homosocial spaces and caring masculinities in Palestinian refugee camps, where men spend a great deal of time deliberating in these homosocial spaces on the best ways to meet the needs of women kin. Similarly, Julie Petit finds Palestinian refugee men as very involved fathers. And Sofiane Mirabet's research with queer Palestinian and Syrian refugees illustrates some resistance to and some complicity with ideals of masculinity. So, so part of what we can do, I think, here too is follow Amar's lead, that we, we continue to look at and examine what social class has to do with all of this and relationship to economies. And Jordan, again, provides a really important example of this, as Jordanian, or refugees rather, Syrian refugees in Jordan are incorporated into a production system. So there's been a transition in Jordan from an ideology of a humanitarian response to refugees to a development response. And this began with the Jordanian Compact of 2016. And Leonard and Turner described this, quote, turning the Syrian refugee crisis into a development opportunity, end quote. So unfortunately, some of this is going to be, and is taking advantage of the feminization of labor that's been taking place really since the globalization of a lot of manufacturing, and what Leslie Sclair called this ongoing need for a, quote, litany of docile, undemanding, nimble-fingered women workers, end quote, who could be paid very little in the global South. So assisting gender ideologies that view women's central place as in home and family, often taken on by host states and humanitarian agencies, reify the notion that refugee women factory workers can be paid little, as their work is only supplementing husbands or fathers, they're only doing temporary work until marriage, or they're doing work that they would otherwise be doing at home, like sewing. So the ideal of giving Syrian refugees a dignified and self-sufficient life is unlikely to be understood in gender-neutral terms. So dignity within family is shaped by gendered expectations of men and women, and these certainly are shot through in labor force participation, right? Where refugee men in Jordan are finding a lot of work in construction work, which is heavily gendered too. Self-sufficiency as well is much more of a gendered masculine ideal than it is for women. And Suad Youssef and Valentine Mohadam have both written extensively about these sort of gendered care, contractual kinds of relationships between men and women in MENA societies. So how exactly is self-sufficiency being imagined in a development scheme when it comes to gender? I guess is sort of like the question. I'll end there on that question, actually. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Dr. Porter, for those wonderful remarks. We are running out of time, so I want to go ahead and try to open it up to our Q&A and maybe broaden this conversation a little bit as I've been reading some of the questions come in. I think an overall trend that we're seeing is sort of this securitization of refugees and migrants. And it draws so many parallels, as so many of you panelists have mentioned. We've seen it here in the United States with the Muslim ban, and the Trump administration actually just announcing that the refugee cap is being set at a record low for 2021. I think it's 15,000. And we're seeing it happen in North Africa to Europe, right? We saw it at the border of Turkey and Greece. We're seeing it with Libyan refugees trying to go to European countries. And so is this sort of part of a global trend that we're seeing in so many countries as you move from case to case? And so with that, I kind of want to bring in our first question from Sergey, who kind of touched a little bit on this. But also wanted to know, what needs to happen, or is there a possibility of a mindset change that can take place globally? And how is this impacting what we're seeing on the ground? I look at the Palestinian refugee question, and many of those refugees are still, 50 to 70 years later, living as refugees. Are Syrian refugees gonna ever go back home? What's in Syria for them to go back to? So I think these are some big questions that we really need to ask. And Jesse, I'll go ahead and start with you and maybe let you take the helm on that, and then we can move to some of the other panelists as well.
Thank you, Mohammed, for these questions. Very interesting questions. Definitely, there's been this trend now, xenophobic views happening all over, all around the globe, in certain spaces more than others. These rhetorics that are constructing these images of people that are coming to, threaten your way of life, people from different religion that are coming to shake your base and whatnot. These xenophobic public discourse that are happening during election times and all this stuff. So exactly, exaggeration, and who is controlling this and what are their interests? Again, within this aspect, when you look at refugee crises, right? The word crises, people movement have been happening across centuries. We all came here from somewhere. Again, different people end up moving different than others depending on their privileges and their stand within their class, society, geographical proximity, and all the ethnicity, religion, and whatnot. I remember a case when I was reading where certain Syrian refugees, a gentleman said that, hey, I turned Christian in order to get access to the Christian church that was promising me to go to Canada and migrate there. And definitely, like you were saying, Susan, less than 1% of the people in Lebanon who considered Syrians there as not refugees, right? They're not refugees. There are displaced people, temporary here. They did not want to repeat the case of Palestinians, where in 1948, they were supposed, like you said, Muhammad, stay a few years until they go back once the conflict is settled. 75 years later, generations, many of those Palestinians do not even know their land. All they hear is the rhetoric from their great-grandparents and from the localities and living in semi-permanent constructions. That's what the Lebanese government for sure made sure that the Syrians will not have. Any semi-permanent structure within those informal camps needed to be destroyed because they do not want to have another civil war or civil conflict, depending on that sectarian imbalance that I call within Lebanon. Now, going back, like what needs to be done, and again, that's why I bring this feminist lens, looking at this case of Lebanon. There needs to be a shift of perception. The construction, like Susan was talking, the definition of refugee that is too broad to be helpful, right? The commitment from states to see what are the main ways for us to be helping these people, and most importantly, work with those refugees. How am I supposed to be able to help you, securitize you, and all this stuff, and when you're not even included within the conversation? See, most of those policies, those practices and whatnot, you do not see any Syrian person sitting there and kind of agreeing and whatnot. How about knowing more about the context? Who are the groups of people? I had many Lebanese friends that live abroad who repeated those xenophobic rhetorics, talking about how the Syrians are the cause of the Lebanese ruin, economic collapse, and whatnot. And then I remember asking that friend, have you ever seen an informal Syrian refugee camp? Again, they were living in the city, so they did not. And 2 seconds later, a Syrian waiter came and offered it. So I'm like, so this is your enemy? He's like, no, X, I'm not gonna call the name. That's my friend, he's different. So those are the things that need to be bridged. And I think from starting from there, so many things would change. Because again, those practices, those policies, they're not limited. I know the intentions is there, but when you don't want to register, when you don't want women to pass their citizenship, guess what? 500,000 of Syrian children that are born in Lebanon are born stateless. So how about them going back to their country? How are they going to go there? And that's all because Lebanon is afraid to give women the right to give citizenship to the children. God forbid a Palestinian would marry them, and then the sectarian imbalance will happen. Again, for you to see like how those xenophobic rhetoric reinforce this vicious cycle that create practices that would hurt these people agency, and those people, of course, they're gonna react in a way to adapt to their new realities, to the new normal, by recreating anxieties and whatnot within Lebanon. And this case is happening all over. When you see how ICE practices are happening here, right? How they treat people around here because they're undocumented. Let's build walls, let's build this, and killing all types of conversation that for them to know what is the beginning, why are you coming here, and what's happening within your country. So I'll end it there and open it up to the others. Thank you.
Absolutely. No, thank you. Thank you so much, Jesse. Great answer. We have another question from Yarisali Phoenix, who I'm going to go ahead and pass to Eric Loeb. Dr. Loeb, what would be the best way for Lebanon to integrate refugees into their society rather than securitizing them? Do you think that Lebanon would be able to build their economy while utilizing some of these refugees? Or could you maybe provide us some input on that?
Wow, that's a
reloaded question.
Yeah, thanks for the question. I mean, obviously it's a challenge because, as you said, again, as I said in my remarks as well, these refugees or displaced people are caught between two developing countries that have been impacted adversely by conflict, particularly Syria, but also now Lebanon. I mean, in the past year, due to corruption and economic mismanagement, the Lebanese economy is collapsing, or depending on who you talk to, has collapsed. With significant currency devaluation and GDP contraction. This is the case also in Syria. That's trying to maintain, the government is trying to maintain its sovereignty, but is also being dependent, and it's just something I've looked at in my research, is somewhat dependent on assistance from countries like Russia and Iran and others. So it's a major challenge to integrate, and I'm not saying that they shouldn't be, of course, and in some ways, as Dr. Zwingel said, we give agency to the refugees and to the displaced population in terms of how, as well, they're able to take advantage of opportunities, and work in certain sectors. As Jesse said, construction, sanitation, agriculture. As we see in the United States, sectors that and as Dr. Porter said, if we look at it as a class basis, that middle class and upper class citizens, jobs they are not necessarily want to do. And of course, I think we also discount the knowledge, skills, and education that these populations bring with them to the country, and their ability also to contribute to higher value sectors in these economies, right? For that possibility as well, and perhaps that's happening. Jesse would know more than me about that, but I know that, of course, Jesse and others want to be optimistic, but it's difficult, given the adversity currently that economically and socially, these countries are facing, even to provide public goods and social services for their own citizens. And for these citizens, forget the refugee and the displaced population, for these citizens to see a future in their own countries. There's a reason why the Lebanese diaspora, for example, is larger than the domestic population. People are finding opportunities outside of that, of their countries, where they don't see a future. So, perhaps someone else on the panel could put a more positive spin, but it's hard to see this in an optimistic light, and unfortunately.
Thank you so much, Dr. Loeb.
Can I add something to that?
Sure.
And in concurrence with what you're saying, actually now you find a trend, Eric, Lebanese from Tripoli and other areas that are not be able to adapt to their new realities with the economy. They're now seeking refuge in other countries within Europe. So definitely.
Absolutely, good point. Great. Okay, let's go ahead and move on to a question from Shireen Yamut. She asks, how could protection be provided for Syrian women and children when it comes to sexual assault as well as child marriage? Since the Lebanese government is barely able to provide protection for Lebanese women, is there anything more that could be done? And I'll go ahead and ask Dr. Zwingel to maybe answer this one. You have some good questions today.
Yeah, I'm not sure if I'm the best one to answer that. I mean, you know, Jesse, I think already framed it. I mean, it's if you have a understanding of providing security that's completely disregarding gendered realities, then you will not think this is sufficiently important. And we don't actually have to go to refugee populations for that. I mean, we know this from our own lives in every part of the state, in every part of the world, that the security of women in their own homes, right, is something that has, and only because feminist movements have hammered this issue homes for so long, has for the longest time, okay, not been recognized by no state in the world. So how would the Lebanese state be all that different, right? So that's maybe one thing I leave it there, and I'm giving more space to other questions, I think, or other people who want to answer.
Dr. Porter, would you maybe like to try to make a remark on that?
Sure. You know, I mean, I think that there's little I can add that hasn't already been said really well by this group. There are some, you know, there's some interesting cases in the world of more radical feminist action in that regard. So for example, Mexican feminists right now have occupied a government building over the issue of violence against women and femicide. And I'm not saying that that will necessarily solve the problem, but it does seem that, you know, we've come up against this wall many times over how do states and their laws and international bodies deal with and grapple with a problem that's often patriarchal and privatized, right? And gets a kind of protection, right? You could use, you know, the term patriarchal or not for that kind of protection, right? That tends to privilege men, right? And it seems that a lot of the conventional solutions can only go so far in what they can do to protect women.
Great.
So I think
Thank you so much. So we actually have a question from one of our colleagues, Dr. Astrid Araras, who wrote me and asked, and maybe if anyone on the panel sees any similarities or differences between the migrant situation of what we're seeing in MENA as compared to what we're seeing in Central America. So if anyone from the panel would like to answer that, or if anyone is familiar with the situation in Latin America.
Well, definitely, there's a lot of similarities regarding the gendered experience, how both of them are escaping oppression and persecution. One, because of actual civil war conflict that's happening in Syria, where you have international forces within invested and whatnot, terrorist groups and whatnot. And then in the other side, you have failed states as well, with a lot of drug wars and corruption and stuff like that, from Honduras to Guatemala, to kidnapping and assassination and whatnot, for those people to run away. Because if you're a mother and you have children around you, by the time they're 12, either they're going to be forced to become part of the gangs, kill people, have to commit crimes and stuff like that, or make sure that you send them off. And again, the experiences are different. See, Lebanon and Syria, until today, even though Lebanon has been independent for a long time, they do not have officially delineated borders. Okay, so the relationship between both countries is different. Again, Syrians were occupying Lebanon, so them moving across border is much easier than Central Americans that have to go through Mexico, that now has pressures from the US to control its borders. Mexico had open borders with Central America, now had to create laws and visa control and all these stuff to border control. They've been trained to securitize their borders. I remember this documentary called La Bestia. I really urge you all to watch it, for you to see how their migration, their story of movement is so much different and so much harsher, where people that jump on that train that goes through Mexico to the US, you see a lot of graphic and really horrifying stories where you actually don't know if you're going to make it in one piece or be violated or abused or sexually or whatnot until you get to the border. And again, once you get to the border, what happens with the American processes of securitization? We've heard what happened in the Homestead and what, with the unaccompanied alien children, right? UACs, unaccompanied alien children, protecting them and putting them in those shelters. And stuff like that, and basically separating families and sending them back. Thanks to what Claire was saying, we need to be creative on how to do it. I remember the Me Too movement. Again, another group that we wanted to invite to FIU, Las Stacy's. All these radical, different ways of approaching it, and not necessarily conventionally throughout just laws, but again, supporting it. Now with the media and whatnot, we have a lot of new tools to get creative and highlight these issues and raise awareness in hopes of creating this mass movement and stuff like that. I will leave it for the rest. Maybe they would like to add something there.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. So we have some really good questions. I have to apologize to the audience. I'm sorry, we're running out of time. We won't be able to get to them all, but there are some really good questions here. So thank you so much for sending those. I want to end on one last question, and I think it's the perfect question to go out on, since we are an educational institution and we are here for our students and our FIU students. So I want to end on Chaya Zwiebel's question. She asks, is there something practical that we as students can do? I know that knowledge and learning is very important, but what else can we do to help? So I open that to the whole panel. If you'd like to make a few closing remarks, any advice, anything you'd like to tell our FIU students or any students watching anywhere, FIU, Lebanon, what can they do as students besides just learning about this situation? Do you have any recommendations?
I can go. I don't know who wants to go first. I mean, I think I would like to take the just out of the learning and of the educating. I think that's actually a lot of important things you can do. So I think what we need to, and this is a long-term perspective in a way to deal with problems like this more effectively, is to understand our common humanity, right? And the fact that migration, voluntary or forced, is something that many people go through. Oftentimes people go through it and it's traumatic, and then once they are settled, they maybe forget that other people are in similar, terrible constraints and traumatic situations, and then because they have made it, they sort of, want to draw a line or close a border or something like that. But it's really something that humans do all the time, right? And that connects us. That's really something that also brings us together. And sometimes it requires support from everybody who is in a better spot. And I think to think about migration that way, and educating yourself and the people around you, for example, when you sit around the dinner table or so and sort of influence a conversation like that, that's actually a huge thing to do. That's what I personally think. There's other things too, but I want to take the just out of the educating.
Thank you.
I mean, I could say a couple things, just having been in Miami for 6 years, is that number one, the International Rescue Committee, and I believe Jesse was involved, but they have a presence here. And I had aside from Jesse, I had a student who got involved and helped families that are here actually, because the International Rescue Committee has been helping Syrian refugee families here in South Florida and elsewhere. I'm not sure how logistically that works now with the pandemic, but it's certainly an organization you could reach out to, and you could have a direct impact on these families here in this area. So that's number one. Number two is that Amnesty International has a branch here in Miami, South Florida area. And at one point they organized an event to speak about this in, I believe it was in a museum in Miami, where we spoke about this issue, but they have meetings as well. Feel free to reach out to me and I can put you in touch with the person who runs their office here. But there's actually practical things that you could do to get involved in this. And of course, you know, it's beyond just educating yourself. It's important to raise awareness because, you know, we're far from the Middle East, and a lot of people here in the United States are not even necessarily aware of the severity of the issue.
Great. Dr. Porter, anything you'd like to add?
I mean, I think everything everyone's already said is really great, and you know, to add to you know, coming up on a very important election, you know, to you know, be as educated as possible on how the candidates stand, both not just the national elections but the local elections on immigration policy, is one of the, you know, the best efficacious things we can do. If you can vote, to vote, or to be involved in, you know, local politics, state and national, but local in particular is so important right now when it comes to these issues.
Such a good point, especially considering we're a few weeks away from a major election. So, and young people tend to have a tendency to not vote or be politically active. So definitely encourage all of you to get out there and vote. I'll go ahead and give the last word to Dr. Abu Arab, if you'd like to make a closing remark.
Well, I just wanted to thank you all for this delightful conversation, and for allowing me to present my book. And I hope you all got to enjoy this rich conversation. And on that note, I am with Claire. Voting, expressing your voice. You have the privilege of having a voice. Go ahead and express it, and do not just stand still, because if you do not vote, then you don't have the right basically to complain later on or whatnot. That's how I see it. So if you have the capabilities, and like Eric was saying, to go reach out, see who are your neighbors that are around you, get to know them. You don't know how many of them actually are in that dilemma. South Florida, Miami is one of the biggest hubs of undocumented people. And what you see on the news is not some far, far away place. Again, the word language is important. Aliens, who are these aliens? These are your neighbors, your friends, your family, and whatnot. Like you, they came to this country. Some of you were privileged enough to have access to papers and whatnot and do it the right way. Others, they don't, either out of ignorance or out of less mean class and race, ethnicity, religion. All these play a role. So please go ahead and raise awareness, vote, and all these stuff. Thank you.
Yes. All right, great. Well, thank you all so much for joining us today. I'd like to go ahead and thank our sponsors, the Green School. I'd like to thank Books and Books, the Ruth K. and Shepard Broad Distinguished Lecture Series, the Mohsin and Fauzia Jaffer Center for Muslim World Studies, and the Center for Women's and Gender Studies. I'd also like to thank our expert panelists for taking the time here today to join us and giving us their wonderful insight. And finally, I'd like to thank the most important people, you in the audience. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us. I've posted the link to purchase Dr. Abu Arab's book in the chat box. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to the Green School. And other than that, I hope wishing everybody a great afternoon. Enjoy the rest of your day and take care. Thank you.